and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for the Senate Education Committee meeting. We are going to start today with a hearing on Senate Bill 173. In committee, it is my hope, but we're not going to rush things. We're going to work our way through this bill. We have neutral testimony and proponent testimony. We do have some written proponent. We do not have any opposition. So that you know, this is very similar to a bill that we worked last year. So what you see in Senate Bill 173 is actually the culmination of the work of last year's committee, which had lots of amendments. So we'll work through that, and then if we have time remaining, we will, I'd like to hand out what I had prepared so far with regard to the budget so that you can see that and look at it and ask some questions with regard to dyslexia. So let's go ahead and start on Senate Bill 173, which is extending the high-density at-risk student weighting, requiring certain transfers to the at-risk fund of a school district and establishing requirements for school district at-risk fund expenditures and for the identification of students eligible to receive at-risk programs and services. Wow, that is a short title for that bill. We should have just come up with something, a little mini-me title, but there we are. So let's hear from our revisers, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senate Bill 173 would amend the Kansas School Equity and Enhancement Act relating to at-risk education programs and services. And I do want to note before I get into the details of the bill that state law considers at-risk students in two ways. One is the free lunch students who are deemed at-risk students for funding purposes only. The other is those students who are eligible to receive at-risk programs and services because of their need for academic assistance. Senate Bill 173 is about those students, not the free lunch students. So I just kind of wanted to make that clear before we dive into the details of the bill. So Section 1 of the bill would explicitly state that the state board is to require local school districts to implement their at-risk educational programs and services to provide additional educational opportunities, interventions, and evidence-based instructions using those at-risk best practices that have been identified by the state board. Additionally, new Section 1 would require a student to be identified as eligible to receive at-risk programs and services if the student meets one or more of the following criteria. If that student is not working on academic grade level, if they're not meeting the requirements necessary for the promotion to the next grade level, or is failing courses of study, if that student is not meeting the requirements necessary for graduation, or has the potential to drop out, if the student has insufficient mastery of skills or is not meeting state standards, if the student has been retained, has a high rate of absenteeism, has repeated suspensions or expulsions from school, is homeless or migrant, is identified as an English language learner, has social emotional needs that cause the student to be unsuccessful in school, or is identified as a student with dyslexia. Now I'm going to move on to Section 3 of the bill, which would extend the high-density at-risk student weighting sunset from July 1, 2020 to July 1, 2023. As it says right there with 2020 date, this weighting has already expired, but last year's budget bill actually continued the funding for the high-density at-risk student weighting for the current fiscal year and also fiscal year 2022. Additionally, Section 3 would require school districts to transfer the portion of the school district's state foundation aid that is directly attributable to the at-risk student weighting and the high-density at-risk student weighting to the school district's at-risk education fund. So now I'm going to talk about the fund a little bit. Currently, school districts can expend money from that fund only on certain expenditures, and Section 4 would add an allowable expenditure for that fund for providing training for classroom instructional personnel on at-risk educational programs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the at-risk educational programs. Right now, the state board is required to identify and approve evidence-based best practices for at-risk programs and instruction. Section 4 would require the state board to publish and provide to each school district a list of those approved programs. And then school districts would be required to expend money in their at-risk educational fund on those approved at-risk educational programs, or they would be allowed to spend money on provisional at-risk programs. And provisional at-risk programs are programs that have been developed by a school district, but then are submitted to the state board for approval. Money could only be spent on those provisional at-risk programs for up to 3 years. The state board would be required under this bill to review provisional at-risk programs, and if those programs satisfy the state board's requirement as an evidence-based best practice, then that provisional at-risk program could be included on the state board's list of approved at-risk programs. Section 4 of the bill would also provide options for delivering at-risk programs or services, and those are listed in the bill, but they include an extended school year, before and after school programs, summer school, extra support for students within a class, tutorial assistance, and class within a class. Then Section 5 of the bill would require the Legislative Post-Audit Committee to direct the Legislative Division of Post-Audit to conduct a performance audit of at-risk education expenditures during calendar year 2022, and then report the findings of that audit to the legislature by January 15th of 2023. And finally, Senate Bill 173 would take effect on July 1 upon publication in the statute book, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive explanation. Committee, what questions do you have for our reviser? I am not seeing any, so we are just going to go ahead and start with testimony. We do have Heidi Zimmerman here. She is our principal auditor, legislative post audit. We are allowing her to go first as neutral because we know that she has other places to be besides just with us. So thank you for being with us, Heidi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. All right. Good afternoon, committee. All right, so as Senator Baumgartner said, I am here to present neutral testimony on Senate Bill 173. As you just heard, among other things, this bill would require the State Board of Education to provide school districts with a list of approved evidence-based at-risk programs. It would continue the requirements that districts spend their at-risk funding only on approved programs, and it would also extend high-density at-risk funding until 2023. So we evaluated at-risk in 2019, and I presented that audit to this committee just a few weeks ago. But I'd like to highlight today a few of the findings from that audit that most relate to the provisions in Senate Bill 173 and things that might provide some helpful context to you as you consider this bill. So first of all, most of the at-risk funding we reviewed was spent on teachers and programs that serve all students rather than focusing on at-risk students. So for the districts that we reviewed, most at-risk funds were used for regular classroom teacher salaries. Further, only 1/3 of the programs districts told us they used for at-risk students were specifically designed for at-risk students. Many of the programs districts reported using did not have strong research finding that they were effective. We reviewed 29 programs and practices districts told us that they used for at-risk students. Only 3 of them showed clear positive effects. Further, some of the most common programs districts used had little to no effect on improving student outcomes. We also looked at the Department of Education and the state board's management of at-risk programs. Most of the at-risk practices approved by the Kansas State Board of Education did not target at-risk students and were not clearly evidence-based. At the time of the audit, state law directed the State Board of Education to identify and approve evidence-based practices for at-risk programs and for the education of at-risk students. Further, state law only allowed districts to spend at-risk funding on the programs the board had approved. We reviewed the board's programs and practices list. Most of the board-approved programs at that time were not related to at-risk programs or at-risk students. Instead, many of the items appeared to be good teaching practices generally. Additionally, department staff could not produce any research to show that the approved items were in fact evidence-based. Additionally, the department's management of the approved at-risk programs reduced effective oversight and made it more difficult for districts to plan. Department staff told us they updated the approved practices and programs list throughout the school year and at the request of school districts. This presents two problems. First, state law only allowed districts to spend their at-risk funding on programs the board has approved. So making additions throughout the year and at district request allowed districts to justify their spending after the fact. Second, it made it more difficult for districts to plan. Districts need to know what programs they have to choose from when they are budgeting at the beginning of the year. The last finding I want to note is that a sunset provision in state law created a conflict with other provisions in law. So districts that qualify for high-density at-risk funding are required to use that funding only on programs or practices the board has approved. If the department determines districts have not used that funding appropriately and have not made sufficient improvement in 5 years, the funds can be withdrawn for the next year. However, high-density at-risk funding is scheduled to sunset in less than 5 years. So as a result, there will be no funds to withhold as a consequence for districts who do not spend their prior funding appropriately. Because Senate Bill 173 maintains this requirement that districts show improvement in 5 years, but sunsets the funding in 2023, this problem remains within Senate Bill 173. The audit also makes a few recommendations. We recommended that the department establish a process to determine that any identified programs and practices are evidence-based and that they are targeted for at-risk students. We also recommended that the board more thoroughly oversee the process for identifying at-risk programs and practices. I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Committee, what questions do you have? Senator O'Shea.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate your patience as I'm still learning, but it appears to me that the board, they're overseeing these at-risk programs and practices and making sure they're evidence-based. This is the State Board of Education, correct?
That is correct.
And what influence do we as legislators have over them to hold that piece accountable?
I'm going to call on our reviser for that.
So the state board is a constitutionally created entity. So it is not like other agencies. So all I would ask is that you just be mindful of that. A lot of it is a little bit unclear and hasn't been established where the lines are. So that's just something you have to consider and keep in mind when you're contemplating these things.
I guess to make that clear, we do not have direct oversight on them. We have one thing that we've spent several days talking about, and that happens to be the Department of Education's budget. But I think that what you will start to hear is pressure from school districts. They need to have an accurate list provided them that is updated routinely. School districts need to have that updated list of programming that's available to them. And so there will be pressure coming from that as well, from that direction as well. Other questions, committee? Senator Petty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And maybe Tamara can just expand on this a little bit more. So constitutionally, the State Board of Education has authority over what?
They have general supervision authority over local school districts. School board.
And so what we're talking about is we're talking about putting, I guess, some more parameters on what that authority should be. When we do that often through legislation, this is just another example of that type of legislation. Would that be correct? Thanks.
I think I will make the ask, Heidi, that you will, and I will just grant right now in our public meeting that you will work with the reviser to come up with the Bloom Amendment so that we resolve the issue with regard to the sunset date. And that's why we are happy that you are here to testify so that that will not be in conflict within the bill. Yes, Senator Dietrich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've never seen our auditors used that way. Can we do that? I mean,
The
work on
auditor,
legislation?
she can give them the language that would make it not in conflict. That's a part of her neutral testimony.
Okay.
So if you will just make sure that our reviser has a copy of that so that we can get a balloon amendment,
We can do that.
okay? Senator Petty.
And this is for Heidi. So I know I've seen this audit in the past, but as you've done legislative audits and, concerning school district, where is the bulk of their money spent?
In terms of at-risk spending,
Just in terms of spending period.
overwhelmingly to staff salaries and benefits.
Right. So seeing that at-risk funding is being used for salaries, that would not necessarily be in conflict with how budgets are used within school districts. They are overwhelmingly for salaries.
They are overwhelmingly for salaries. In the context of this bill says in order for a school district to spend their at-risk funding, they have to spend it on a program or practice that the board has approved and the educational personnel associated with it or contracted services associated with it. Senate Bill 173 also adds professional development related to those programs and practices. So for at-risk spending, the gateway is what practices and programs the board has approved. If the board has approved a practice or program and a teacher is implementing it in the classroom, then by statute, that would appear to be okay, that it was used, that funding was used by staff so long as they were following the board's approved programs.
I will take that a step further. The reason that we have this bill and the reason we have the things that were added or changed from existing law is because the assumption is all children that attend our schools are going to have a teacher. But at-risk funding is to be used for the services above and beyond just having a classroom teacher. That's why the utilization, so if a particular building had 50% at-risk students, what we saw is that salary, 50% of salaries were coming out of at-risk funding, and it was the thought at the time, no, the classrooms were to have a teacher no matter what. And there was not a direct correlation to how many at-risk kids or what those needs were within the classroom compared to the 50%. That was simply what the school itself or the district had. Senator Straub.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In your testimony, you said that there were approximately 29 programs that you reviewed, or there's 29 programs that they're using?
29 programs that we reviewed. Districts use more programs than that. Those were the programs we were able to review through a federal clearinghouse.
Okay. And then of those 29, only 3 were deemed effective?
3 were deemed effective at improving student outcomes. I believe another 11 were potentially effective, and the remaining 15 either showed no results or mixed results.
And really my question surrounding that is, I know that some of the criteria, we've discussed it in previous committee meetings, the criteria used to determine an at-risk student. So do we really have that many at-risk students, or is it the criteria that we are using that deems them at risk?
State statute lists what students are at risk, lists the criteria. It is the school districts who are in charge of determining whether a student meets that criteria. So in terms of whether or not that count is accurate, we didn't review that in this audit.
Senator Erickson and then Senator Sykes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Heidi. Thank you for your information. And this is for whomever can answer it, the revisor or Heidi. When was the high-density at-risk funding put into the funding formula?
Tamara, my recollection is maybe around 2007, 2008, somewhere in there. You probably know more than I do.
I don't know off the top of my head, but I'll have to go back into the SDF QTA to confirm, and I will do that.
I believe it was sometime after post-audit conducted the cost study, which was in 2006.
Senator Erickson?
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of follow-ups. Approximately how much money per year are we talking about with this weighting?
In total, between the at-risk weighting and the high-density at-risk weighting, in 2019, which was the year we looked at in the audit, was $413 million.
Just the high-density part of that, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is around 50 to 55 million. Does that
That's correct,
sound
I think.
about right? So just for the high-density, if we say 50 million a year for 13, 14 years, we're talking several $100 million just in high-density weighting. Would that be accurate?
Probably not quite that much because the weighting is tied to the base. So as the base goes up, the weighting goes up. 13, 14 years ago, the base was a little bit lower. The mechanism on that may have changed as well, but it's been a number of years that this funding has been in place, and it is a reasonable amount of money.
My final question, and this may be for one of the conferees. Has the money that we've invested in high-density weighting improved student outcomes for at-risk students?
In this audit, we did not look at outcomes. In the audit that is in Senate Bill 173, it would have us look at outcomes for at-risk students.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Sykes?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Heidi, for being here. My question is, with the audit that would be scheduled for the 2022, how does that affect other audits? I know we have economic development audits and other school funding audits. What does that do to the audit schedule?
I believe it would probably have minimal impact. We are able to add another audit in that year. There is also another education audit scheduled for that year, the virtual school audit. We would simply do both, but I believe that impact would be minimal. The post auditor is here. I don't know if he has more thoughts on that.
You may certainly come to the microphone.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Justin Stowe, Post Auditor. Yes, Heidi is correct. We have a capacity to do between 10 to 15 audits in any given year. So with the one that you already have on the books, plus the one added by Senate Bill 173, and a couple others we have our eye on this session that come through the various statute, we'd still be fine to be able to address many ad hoc requests from the Post Audit Committee that come through the legislature. So I think a minimal impact is a fair assessment.
Okay, thank you. Just one follow-up, Justin. So out of those 10, 15, how many are mandated in statutes?
Good questions.
And if you have to get back to me, that's fine. Just, I appreciate all that post-audit does, and I want to make sure that we're still allowing for that. So thank you.
Madam Chair, I will get back with the committee with the specific. That's a little complicated because we have some that are in off years. So we have some that come every couple, 3, 5 years. So I will get that information on a 5-year cycle back to the committee within the day.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We are going to move on to the proponents. First up, we have Mr. Bowie, Executive Director, USA, Kansas, and Kansas School Superintendents. You are with us today virtually. So I'm going to kind of watch the clock. We do have 4 individuals that are giving proponent testimony, and go ahead, Mr. Bowie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today. We did take the opportunity to work with a couple of different groups last year on taking a closer look at this bill and trying to offer some suggestions on how we could make this bill more workable and more palatable to everyone. And I think we were able to do that last year. Obviously, we'd like to see a more long-term effect than a 2-year sunset, but we understand the challenges that are there as well. But I think one of the things that we'd like to just kind of highlight is, if we were only looking at academic strategies to help students be successful, at-risk students be successful, I think everybody's job would be a lot easier if we could identify a student that needs support or needs help. And we could put an academic component to that and help that student become successful. I think that's the easiest part of working with at-risk students. The challenge really exists in our schools, especially those that have the need for high density at risk, is many of those challenges, we have to find the root of the problem. It's not just a simple reading or math issue. Oftentimes it could be a social emotional issue, social emotional challenge. It could be home life situations. It could be things that truly affect what's going on with the learning. And those are items that we have to continue to work with, which requires staff, specialized staff, and specialized programming. One of the reasons you see some challenges, some dollars spent in the classroom, are often so we can train the teachers and help teachers understand how to recognize these issues and challenges. Also, I think in the early 2012, 13, 14 era, we saw a number of dollars being spent in classrooms for classroom teachers to help keep classroom sizes down. And so oftentimes we may not see the increase in academic success, but we may see things maintain or improve on small scales because we're keeping kids in school, we're keeping kids engaged, and we're helping them with other things that may not be academic, but they affect the academics a great deal. So there's a lot of pieces there that we're working with. And the other thing with identifying at-risk students is oftentimes at-risk students may start the school year and there are no risk factors. They may be doing just fine, everything's going well, but something changes in their life, something changes in their home life, something they change within their personal life, and they now become an at-risk student. There may be concerns they have that are affecting their learning outside of the actual school. I think one of the biggest challenges we have with helping kids improve is we only get 6 hours with them a day. They spend the majority of their days outside of school and without teachers working with them directly. So there's a lot of things that are affecting a student's learning that are outside of school. And that's, again, a number of those supports that we have in schools are beneficial to help keep kids engaged, keep kids coming to school, keep their attendance at a high rate, and supporting them on a social emotional level so they can go to the classroom and learn and learn at a higher level. I think we continue to see as more and more programs are out there, more and more opportunities on research-based programs are out there and at-risk kids. I think we see more and more schools adopting those and working with those as they move forward. So in the end, I think my point is that there are a lot of factors that affect students in our schools. And I think part of that is simple reading or math issues and challenges. But oftentimes we have to understand what causes those issues or challenges. Just like we've discovered the needs and support for dyslexia, there are other issues that are supporting these kids that we have to be very aware of. And with the loss of programming within some of our communities, as far as social and emotional supports with our community and county services, juvenile justice changes, we see more and more kids in schools that maybe at one time were not in our schools or were receiving outside support that now we're supporting in our schools. So with that, Madam Chair, I'll stop my testimony, allow the others to testify, and then be happy to stay for questions.
Very much. Next up, we have Mark Dissetti, Legislative and Political Advocacy for Kansas National Education Association. And I just want to note for the committee that Mr. Dissetti did share with us that the high density weighting was put into law in 2006, so we've had that for 15 years. Mr. Dissetti.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me? I can't see myself or anything.
I can't, now we see you. We see you and we hear you.
Wow, there you go. Isn't technology wonderful? We stand in support of this bill, Kansas NEA. I recall that last year I was testifying against a bill that Mike O'Neill was testifying in favor of here. And Madam Chair, you directed me to work with Mike and come up with some kind of solution to this issue of what programs and how long and everything else. Mike chose at that time to just say to me, Mark, you write it and we'll talk about it later. And I did sit down with Mark Tallman and Jim Porter, Dodie Welshire, and we worked on language. And a lot of that language is in this bill, which is why we're able today to stand up here in support of this bill. While Mike, representing KPI, not sit with us and participate in the writing, I went back and forth with Mike on all of the issues and things we were making. We agreed to most of them outright and had to go back and forth and negotiate a couple. But by the end of that, we came before this committee and presented you with a series of recommendations that both Mike O'Neill and the education advocacy groups agreed on. And I believe those are all gathered in this bill before you today, which is again why we're able to stand up in here and say this. Particularly, a couple of things that we really fought hard for in this bill was the creation of the provisional programs. And as you know, that sometimes a program that is very good isn't on that list. A great example in Kansas is the JAG program, which this committee and many legislators have admired for some time, but it took years for it to get on the list, and now it's recognized as an excellent program. So the provisional program piece of this bill allows for school districts that might find things at conferences, hear things that are being used in other school districts around the country that they'd like to try in their own school district. It gives them the opportunity to do that for a limited period of time, and we think 3 years is an adequate amount of time. And if that program proves to be effective, it can then go on the state list, just as the JAG program did. So we're pleased to see that the 3-year provisional programs have been included in this legislation. We also argued quite strongly for professional development, that when you're trying new programs, they're not going to be effective unless the teachers are trained in implementing that program, and professional development seems piece of making sure that whatever program is implemented is successful. So we are happy that you saw fit to put that professional development recommendation in this bill. Finally, of course, the bill codifies the criteria that districts use now to determine which students participate in the approved at-risk programs, with the addition of dyslexia. We supported the development of the dyslexia task force. In fact, KNEA worked very strongly with at that time Representative Dietrich to get that task force set up and rolling. So we're pleased to see the inclusion of that in here as well. We supported the task force discussions, we supported their recommendations, and we support this placed in there too. So, Madam Chair, in closing, we're pleased to see this legislation includes the work we did last year with Mr. O'Neill to find common ground, that a bill has. We appreciate the bill before you clarifies expectations and still allows flexibility to schools and districts seeking new and better ways to meet the needs of students. Our only criticism would be on the extension of at-risk weighting. We really would prefer a lifting of the sunset on at-risk weighting, but in the very least, an extension of it that would be adequate to cover provisional programs. And to that end, Madam Chair, I would stand for questions at the appropriate time.
How much? Next up, we have Mike O'Neill, Kansas Policy Institute.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee, and thanks to Mark. With COVID, our dirty little secret is about the only time we see each other is in the produce section of the Dillon store on Wakarusa in Lawrence. So if any further negotiations are necessary, that may have to be the venue for our discussions. But anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to appear today on a bill that this committee and some of you maybe or on the House side at the time we did this, are well aware of. The House version was a little bit more limited than what the chair was able to work through with the committee last year. The House vote was 111 to 14. You worked hard on the bill on this side, and unfortunately, once again, COVID interrupted your deliberations, and we had to start over again this year. I also appreciate Legislative Post Audit having given the committee, and particularly the new members, a briefing on what we consider to be a very important and impactful audit of at-risk. And the key here, just to kind of put a fine line on it, is that we have a whole bunch of baskets of funding. And the at-risk, the idea of adding an at-risk weighting was to target kids that were truly at risk of not being able to meet the outcomes that we are hopeful that they will be able to attain during their K through 12 experience. And even the Kansas Department of Education on their website talks several times about additional services. And that is key, because what was sort of exposed in the post-audit was using those funds to just kind of transplant and generally just pay for general education. And that was not the intent. And of course, when you run into a situation like that, it's incumbent on the legislature to determine or reevaluate and then restate or reconfirm what your intent is, and let the board and the department know. I'm going to digress for just a moment and address Senator Petty and Senator O'Shea's questions about the legislature vis-a-vis the State Board of Education. That's Article 6, the education article, in Section 2. The legislature shall provide for a State Board of Education which shall have general supervision of the public schools, educational institutions, and all the educational interests of the state, except educational functions delegated by law to the Board of Regents. But then the key sentence for your purposes, the State Board of Education shall perform such other duties as may be provided by law. That means you. So even though the State Board in a 1976 Supreme Court decision that suggested that the State Board does have certain self-executing powers, that they kind of can legislate a few things on their own, the Constitution is very clear that you can supplement the things that you want the board to do by statutory enactments. And that's what this particular bill would do. And frankly, what it has done for the past several sessions. We had changes in the law in 18, we had changes in the law in 19, and now we're looking at changes in the law in 21 to address this at-risk issue. What I want to point out to you, and what the attachments to my testimony I hope you'll take a look at, is that even today, even after changes made in 19, which do not appear on the website, and even after last year's briefing on the legislative post-audit, that website has not been updated. It's been updated somewhat, but it has not been updated to a degree that is helpful. And so I have actually provided copies of what you'll find on the website. And one of those, and I'm glad Mark mentioned this, because he mentioned the JAG program. If you want to find what has been listed, you go to the Kansas Department of Education website, you look under Agency, the tab Division of Learning Services, the tab Special Education and Title Services, the tab Announcements, Special Education and Title Services, and then you get to Best Practices. And the best practices don't necessarily square with at risk. It's just a category of best practices. Under the Best Practices tab is a tab ks.gov approved list of evidence-based practices and programs. I've given you the pages that are listed. There's 255, if I counted correctly, general resources that you've already heard LPA talk about in terms of no research to back that up, not sure they're all or even any of them are truly related to at risk, and certainly nothing to indicate that they are evidence-based programs. And we emphasize programs. We're not just looking for a bibliography of sources. We're looking for tested programs. And a program suggests more than just, hey, go to this chapter or go to this article and read it and then decide how you want to use it, if you want to use it at all. I think the intent of the legislature is to actually look at programming that provides additional support and help for kids that are at risk that's over and above what we do in the classroom. So for instance, if you look at the LPA study, they mentioned two, Lexia, I think, and advanced, I can't remember what it was. Bear with me a minute. Two of the programs were Lexia and accelerated reading as being ones that they just singled out as not being very helpful. According to the What Works Clearinghouse, the most common programs district told us they used for at-risk students had little to no effect, and they list those two as just two examples. Those are still on the list. And what is not on the best practices list is the JAG program, which everybody agrees is probably the premier, for the age group that JAG takes care of, the premier at-risk program that's successful. But Mark is correct. The department does acknowledge JAG, but they list them under the category state-based national nonprofit organizations. Jobs for American Graduates Kansas, Communities and Schools, Boys and Girls Clubs of America, not listed under best practice, approved list of evidence-based practices and programs. And you know why that is? Because the statute said that best practices shall include but not be limited to these national programs. And so what did the department do? The least amount of work that they could get away with, and so they just list them as a state-based national nonprofit organization, not giving the schools any indication that they ought to be using their money on programs, not necessarily just that program, but programs like them. And that's where I think you maybe should spend a little time and just look at what the department is doing in terms of what you intended them to do, and make sure the legislation actually is calculated to get them to do and provide what it is that you're asking them to do. We have no, my organization, Kansas Policy Institute, has no real position on the high density at risk. We do acknowledge that currently in the bill, the sunset provision extension is probably too short. I did see on your list of bills, if not your agenda, one that would lift it all together and make it a permanent. We don't have a position on that, but we do acknowledge that that date needs to be extended. And with that, I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you very much. Last up, we have Mark Tallman, Associate Executive Director, Kansas School Board Association. I'm going to ask you to be brief and only address issues that we haven't heard yet.
I agree with what everyone has said almost entirely, and if you have any questions, I will respond at that point.
What a wonderful gift. Thank you so much. Committee, we are going to ask questions. We're going to ask questions. We're going to get through this. I do want us to move on to two other things before we leave today. Senator Sykes, then Senator O'Shea.
Thank you. This is for Mark, and Mike, and I appreciate you all coming together. This was a big lift, and as the chair talked about all the amendments, but I just want to ask, are you all responsible for the cold weather that we're experiencing?
That would be Mr. O'Neill.
Okay. Senator, now that we know that, Senator O'Shea.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. This one is for Mike O'Neill. You said very quickly on the website where to find that information, and I was trying to, so I wondered if you could just share that again. You said Kansas Department of Education, and then, or email it to me.
Actually, it's in it's in the testimony.
Okay, I didn't see
the attachment.
So I will look. Oh, okay. Yeah, I was going to say I didn't see it.
Oh, the attachments aren't, you don't have the attachments? Yeah.
Thank you.
So you go to their website, the tab is Agency, Division of Learning Services, Special Education and Title Services, Announcements, Special Education and Title Services, and then Best Practices. I saw a Facebook post today that said the Groundhog said there'd be 6 more weeks for winter. And Texas responded, hold my beer, we'll do it in 6 days.
Senator Erickson.
Thank you. You might as well stay up there. Thank you, Madam Chair. Real quick question. It's my understanding, talking about this list on KSDE, that a lot of the resources that were put on the website was in response to KSDE recognizing that they were supposed to have these listed, and so they asked districts, what are you doing? And they said, here's what we're doing, and those are what ended up a lot of these on. Is that accurate?
Yes, this 3 or 4 page evidence-based practices was not in existence when we testified last year. And so that has come about. And my only concern about that is is that helpful? 255 smorgasbord listings without any evidence of research.
I'm going to ask our legislative post-audit, Heidi Zimmerman, to come up, because I saw a shaking no of her head, so it might have been in a different location.
That is possible. It may be in a different location. When we conducted the audit, which would have been spring and summer of 2019, that list did exist at that time, and it was posted on their website. That list, I believe at least some of that list did come from the Department of Education. My understanding is that over that year, as districts were finding things, they were asking the department to add things, and things were perhaps being added. But at the time that we conducted the audit, like I said, probably early to mid 2019, that list was already in existence at that time.
Thank you very much. Senator Petty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this is a question, I'll go with Mark.
Be more specific.
Just Eddie. Okay, you're right, there are a couple marks. So I'm just curious on because you and Mike did work on the bill together, and I wasn't on this committee last year, but I know it's always great when you can get this collaboration going. I'm just curious, when this list was composed that's on page 1 of the bill, and you know, school districts have spent a lot of time, and we've in the last 10 years talking about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and I'm just curious why that might not be added to the list.
I can answer that question. The list, are you talking about starting on line 20 of page 1?
Yes.
That is the list from the Department of Education.
I know, but there is one thing added, and that's dyslexia. So I'm just curious as to if we're really, you know, looking at how we're gauging at-risk students within our district. And we heard from testimony from Mr. Booley earlier, and the question has often come up in here about at-risk, how are at-risk children identified, and what kinds of things come into play. That's one of the things that school districts have spent a lot of time, not just school districts, but we all have, we should be doing, but school districts specifically have done it with their in-service. I think maybe Senator Dietrich could even speak to that, so that their staff and are aware of the kinds of things that have a traumatic impact on children's lives and impact their educational ability at the time.
I'm not going to challenge that. I'm going to simply say the Department of Education, this was their list in our hearings. It was brought up that we did need to include and add dyslexia. I would challenge that the Department of Ed at any point in time could have added ACEs to it. I will challenge this notion of teachers finding out within school districts what children are actually at risk. And so that's a different issue. But if you would like to bring an amendment to add ACEs, that would be fine. I'm just not certain. I'm not certain that our school districts are doing that screening. But that would be another thing to consider. Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of the things that we've struggled with is the definition of at-risk. And so one of the mindsets, for lack of a better word, and this is for any of the conferees, is speaking of ACEs, is coming from the viewpoint that all children are traumatized. So therefore, if that's going to be, the underlying assumption, would that then mean that all students are at risk?
Mr. Tallman looks like he is wanting to answer that question.
Since I was so brief, I think the way we've tried to balance is this to say, pretty much what is on the list that would be in statute and the board has identified to this point mostly do require some evidence that a negative impact is happening to the child academically. So I don't have that list completely in front of you. For the most part, are you at grade level? Are you tardy? Are you absent? There are a few other cases. So we know that ACEs, trauma, all those things may be a problem. In and of themselves, they don't guarantee the child will be at risk. They just are a greater likelihood that that will show up. And that's why the state has always used, in most states, to determine the money, use the poverty factor, because it's sort of a greater likelihood that those will happen to kids in poverty, but not exclusively, and that's why we have this bifurcated system. Use one factor to determine the pool of money, use another set of factors for kids who are actually demonstrating need. Did that help?
Yes, I understand that. It just, to me, this is going to be, the issue with dealing with this bifurcated system that you referred to is, one for the money, one for and all the factors that go into determining is complex. And so trying to get the resources to the right student at the right time is, to me, just, it's very complicated.
It is, and I think that's why our association has always been open to looking at kind of different ways of getting there. It just seems when you look at actual results, the closest correlation tends to be income. Not always, of course, but those districts that have the highest percentages of low-income kids, kids in poverty, also tend to have lowest test scores, lowest graduation rates, all the other factors associated. And that was the justification for the high density to begin with. So I agree, it is very challenging, but this seems to be what most states are doing in a reasonable way of getting at it. Well, no, I know you're running out of time. I'll hold that last thought for another time.
That's fine. So we are going to be working this next week. So one of the things that I think we need is some clarification. So I am going to ask Heidi Zimmerman and Mike O'Neill to get together with regard to the list. Let's make sure that we were looking at the same lists. Let's see how they're different, where they're actually located. I think that would be helpful. I think that we are going to go ahead right now and we are going to close the hearing on Senate Bill 173. Committee, there are a couple of things that I want to touch base with you. First of all, you did receive a copy of Senate Bill 43, which has all of those changes for the Promise Scholarship. Did you have an opportunity to look at that? Do you have questions about that? Cindy? Yes. Cindy emailed that separately. Okay, if you have not had a chance to look at it, then that will be the first thing that we do tomorrow. The next thing, so we will be, I want you to look at the revisions with the Promise Act. I want you to note that the dark highlight is what was deleted, and the light highlight is what we have added or amended. That's what's new to the text. So that will be our first order of business tomorrow. The next thing that I want to provide you, what's the question? Senator Straub?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Real quick question. On the Science of Reading program, who developed that program or where does it come from?
Okay, we're talking about Senate Bill number 43, which is the Promise Act.
I must have mistaken. I looked at the email from Cindy. My apologies.
That's okay. What I did just hand out to you is my preliminary draft version with regard to budget. That will be the second thing that we vote on tomorrow, is going to be our budget recommendations. This addresses the dyslexia coordinator position, some bullets with regard to what we believe the dyslexia coordinator shall do, a grant for the Center for Reading Projects Manager, a stipend for an interim coordinator or consultant, as well as an implementation grant for our colleges, universities. Does everyone have a copy? Okay. So if you would review that and also bring any other recommendations that you have tomorrow with regard to the education budget. Senator Sykes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to clarify, on 43, the red highlight has been deleted and the blue is what's inserted. Okay.
Yes, when you print it out, the red appears darker.
Okay.
Blue appears lighter. We don't have a color printer, so we have that. Committee, I was hoping that we could pass out a couple bills today. It doesn't seem that we have time, so our committee meeting is adjourned. Thank you for your work.